Hey y'all, this is Ramblin Chris. Today we're going to talk about the rear brake switch. Now on these Sportsters, and I believe on many Harleys, what you have is right in here, you have this hydraulic pressure switch. So when you put the brake pedal down, you're increasing pressure in the line, which then triggers the switch, and then in turn turns on the brake light. Now if I put pressure in the rear brake, you get nothing. Front brake, the light is there, so you know it's not a filament in the bulb. So now we know it's the rear brake switch. Something to do with the electronics here. Now it could be wiring, it could be the switch. So the best way to check is pull the wires off of the switch. After the wires are off, next we want to try and complete the circuit to see if the light comes back on. So just grab some of this case. I'm grabbing a wrench I happen to have out that I'm going to need for the job. And I'm just going to connect the two circuits. You can see as I connect the circuit, the brake light comes on. So it has to be the switch because it's not the wire. So with the wires all unhooked, now we can just simply remove the valve. Now here's one thing to be aware of. There's brake fluid in this. So depending on what brake fluid your bike uses determines what can happen here. If you have DOT 5, very important, DOT 5. That is a synthetic silicone-based brake fluid. It is non-corrosive, it does not take on water. It's also a bit more expensive, but that's what this bike goes with. It also does not mix with DOT 3, 4, or 5.1. Those are glycol based. And those ones, if you get it on your paint, it will eat your paint. So that's something to be aware of. If you have 3, 4, 5.1, it's highly recommended you drain your brake lines before you remove this valve. Alright, so we're going to remove the valve. So for this, we're using an 11/16 wrench. Let's get in there and let's spin her out. Alright, there we go. She is out. Now being a fluid, there's always a potential for leaks. So, before we install the switch, we are going to wrap it in a Teflon tape. Wrap it real tight. All you need is just a couple turns. Be sure to keep her flat as you do it. Alright, here we go. Now we can install the switch. Just reach on in there and start to install it with your fingers. Tighten as much as you can by finger tightness. Okay, now the switch is in. Now one thing I did take off before I started this video, there's these rubber boots that they have to protect the wires from all the rain and elements and whatnot. We are going to put this back on, but first we're going to hook up the wires and we're going to see if it brake works yet. Most likely it will need bled first. We will see. This is DC, so it doesn't matter the order in which you install these. Alright, switch is hooked up. Now when you bleed the brakes, you have a couple options. You have the vacuum bleeding, you have reverse bleeding, and the method we're going to do today is manual bleeding. Before I get into that, I'm going to go through what the other two methods are. So for vacuum bleeding, you're going to hook up the vacuum pump to the bleeder valve on your brake. And what the vacuum pump will do, it will suck the fluid through. That way all you have to do is just keep topping off the reservoir, making sure it doesn't get too low to keep air from getting in it. And once you stop getting bubbles in the hose, you know your brakes are bled. For reverse bleeding, it's very similar, but it's going the opposite way. You're once again hooking up here, but that you are then forcing fluid back in through, up into the reservoir. In that case, you got to watch for bubbles in the reservoir. And if the reservoir starts getting too full but is bubbling, you have to remove some fluid. Method we're going to use is manual bleeding. So for that, we're once again going to hook up a hose here on the bleeder valve. But then we're going to make sure it loops above, that way air doesn't come back into the system. Then it's going to go down into a bottle, which is going to have fluid in it to prevent air from getting back up in. And we are simply going to press down on the brake pedal, then crack open the bleeder valve just a little till fluid starts to flow, and close it again, and then release the brake pedal. You're going to do that till there stops being air, while once again making sure that you are not letting the fluid in the reservoir get too low. So for this, we need just a couple tools. You need a bottle, in my case a 1/4 inch wrench, 3/8 inch wrench, which will work for pretty much all of you, a length of tubing, and some brake fluid. In my case, DOT5. Alright, let's get started. Okay, step 1. We're going to remove the cover of the rear master cylinder reservoir. So in this case, you can use a screwdriver or a 1/4 inch wrench. I'm using the wrench because the rear one, I cannot get a screwdriver in there unless I remove the exhaust. And if I can just use a wrench instead of a screwdriver, and yeah, sounds a lot easier than taking off exhaust. Alright, so there's one screw. Okay, and there's 2. Now we can just take off the cap. And there's our brake fluid. The level still looks pretty good. When we press it, I'm not seeing any air bubbles, so that's a good sign. You also give tap on the banjo bolts. No fluid's coming up, so that's good. Now we're moving over to the caliper side. First thing, take off the dust cover. Set that aside. Then grab your 3/8 inch wrench and put it on top of the bleeder. Reason being, once you get this hose on, it's going to be harder to put it on. Next, tape your length of hose. Get her up on the bleeder. Cut doesn't look that good. Let's try the other side. Yeah, and she's on there. One little tip. If you take a zip tie, you put it around, it'll help hold that in place. Another obvious option, of course, is a hose clamp. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to apply pressure to the brake a few times, try and pump them up a little bit. Then what you're going to do, you're going to press it down all the way. You're just going to crack the bleeder to get some fluid. You can close it. Let up the brake. See, there's some bubbles in there. So we're going to pump her up a few more times in here. Press her down all the way. And crack her. And from there, you want to check the reservoir. Just keep doing it. While you're doing this, this is a very good time to flush your brake lines. You see we're still getting some bubbles. It's actually looking a little more bubbly because we were all the way up there and we had to flush all that out. So keep that in mind. If you don't see bubbles initially, it may not be because there's not air in the line. It may be just because the air didn't make it there yet. Okay, so I haven't seen any air bubbles for a little bit. So I think we are good. Pressure of the brake pedal feels really good. So now we're going to put the cap back on the reservoir and and we should be good. So let's get this reservoir cap back on. Cap sitting on there. In this case, you can tell orientation very easily because if you can read the words on here, then you know you're facing the right way. So I set that on there. I like to go with finger tight to start. Now you may ask, why I spend so much time on finger tightening? Well, because this is a rubber gasket, and rubber gaskets you should not be cranking on too hard. They are made to essentially seat and then a little bit more. Just need to compress them a little, and no fluid's getting out. Now if you look at your sight glass here, you can see it's fully black. So our brakes are good, and that's a nice solid pedal there. Let's try and, she's in neutral, we're gonna try and roll her backwards. And then step on the brake and make sure she stops for us. Yep, that brake grabs real nice. There you go, comes on real easy. Barely even touching the brake. After you do that, you should be all good to go. So just unplug your wires again. Then we're just gonna widen this boot out enough to bring her over top. A lot of times it's a little easier said than done, but we'll do what we gotta do. That she's on there. Just pull that boot up so you have access to your wires. It's 1 and 2. Pull the boot over the wires. There we go. So the only thing left to do is take her out for a test drive, make sure she's working how we want. There it go. Brake light's still working. Brake works really well. This has been Ramblin' Chris. I'll see y'all next time.